Let me begin by asking you a question. Did you learn the American Revolution as the epic of idealists fighting for freedom, or as a cold-blooded geopolitical investment by two European monarchies seeking to bring the world's greatest empire to its knees? If your answer was the former, then history has shown you only the part the victors wanted written. And when you look at the Middle East today, when you see the weapons America provides to Israel or the Iranian petrodollars filling Hezbollah's coffers, you are not witnessing the spirit of 1776, but the very financial architecture of 1776 itself. That's when you realize that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes perfectly. Now let's begin to decode that rhyme, word by word. In the marble corridors of the Palace of Versailles, while the advisors of King Louis XVI debated sending money, weapons, and naval forces to the rebels in Philadelphia, not a single person at that table uttered the words freedom or human rights. Because the only agenda of that meeting was to wear down England, thousands of miles from its own lands, using the blood of others, without being forced into direct war. And this strategy was so calculated, so rational, that even Spain, officially at peace with England, was present at that table. Still, through Louisiana and Havana, it funneled money to the Continental Army through covert channels. Because for states, ideology is a costume, interest is the skeleton itself. And at this point, the real question emerges. When you see the money that builds Hamas tunnels, the networks that finance Hezbollah's missile systems, the covert transfers of oil revenues, can you truly distinguish this from the Franco-Spanish corridors before 1776? Or are you simply watching the same game in different costumes? Before we reach an answer, I need to tell you a deeper truth. Because the financing of the American Revolution was not just a geopolitical strategy, it was the womb of the modern world order. And to understand what the child raised in that womb sees when it looks at the Middle East today, you must first accept this. Benjamin Franklin did not go to Paris for philosophical debates. He went to convince the French Foreign Minister Versailles that the rebels could win, that the investment would pay off, and that England would bleed in the process. In that role, Franklin was not a diplomat. He was effectively a salesman. And what he was selling was a proxy war, cheap, effective, and operating in a grey zone not yet fully defined by international law. Vergennes bought the product, because Bourbon France, having lost the 7 Years' War and its influence in Canada and India to England, was crushed under a burden of revenge. And paying that debt through direct war was too expensive. But financing others to fight, bleeding your rival without deploying your own soldiers, was far more rational, both economically and strategically. Now pause and think. Look at Iran's state budget today, a country squeezed by sanctions, economic pressure, and nuclear ambitions. It cannot directly wage war in Syria. It cannot directly fire missiles at Israel. So what happens? It can fund an organization in Lebanon, establish a weapons supply chain in Gaza, open a front in Yemen. The total cost of these is less than even 1% of a direct war, yet the strategic impact is far more dispersed, resilient, and cost-effective. So, who calculated this first? Not Khomeini, not Richelieu, not even Vergennes. In fact, that's not even the right question, because this calculation is written in humanity's oldest ledger. Persian Emperor Artaxerxes, distributing gold to divide Greek city-states, or the Romans buying off Carthage's allies for decades before destroying it. At this point, recall a famous book, Sun Tzu's The Art of War. At its core, it is a book of cost analysis. Its most famous line, "The supreme victory is to win without fighting," is not idealism, but accounting. Sun Tzu calculates the daily cost of armies, supply chains, and the economic burden of prolonged war, and offers a solution: defeat your enemy indirectly. And that indirect method, in modern terms, is the proxy war. Now we arrive at the most unsettling point. Today, while the United States supplies weapons to Israel and tries to break the chains that feed Hamas, it simultaneously occupies the position of both financier and adversary of financiers. Because the stones once thrown by France and Spain to shape America now land in the soil of the Middle East, and the hand throwing them today is Washington. But here is the real paradox. America is both the financier and the target of financiers. When you consider China and Russia's support for Iran, you see that proxy warfare has evolved into a three-layered structure. The Middle East is no longer a regional issue. It is a labyrinth where global power balances are tested indirectly. And to map this labyrinth, you must go not to Versailles, but to a darker room, the think tanks of Washington, D.C. If I asked you, in a democracy, are policies shaped through debate among elected representatives, or are they largely formed behind closed doors in advisory rooms before being presented to the public? What would you say? Institutions like Rand Corporation, Brookings Institution, and the American Enterprise Institute, largely funded by arms manufacturers, energy companies, and financial groups, produce a significant portion of the policy proposals presented to Congress. These proposals are then normalized through analysts appearing on television as independent experts. And as you watch, believing you are seeing an objective academic, you are often witnessing a narrative machine packaging the interests of its financiers in scholarly language. This should remind you of the propaganda efforts of the 1920s. Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, observed how the US government manipulated public opinion during World War I to increase support for the war, and later applied these techniques to civilian marketing. Because in democracies, power is not gained by conquering land, but by conquering narratives. So the question of who frames the narrative of conflict in the Middle East is as important, if not more important, than who finances it. To see this entire structure clearly, you need a moral compass. But neither Western neoliberal economics nor pure realpolitik can provide it, because both treat economics as a technical field detached from ethics. Yet the great 12th century Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali warned, "A society that loses the moral compass of money decays not from the outside, but from within. First its values erode, then its economy, then its politics, then its institutions, and finally, its lands." Apply this warning to the Middle East today, and you will see, in countries receiving billions in military aid, education budgets, healthcare systems, and civil institutions collapse, because proxy wars do not only wear down the enemy's army, they corrode the institutions of the recipient as well. Libya experienced this, Syria experienced this, Iraq experienced this. This is not coincidence, it is structural. Because externally financed conflict traps both the fighters and the financiers in a cycle that produces no moral progress. Now let's expand this invisible network. Today, petrodollars from Gulf countries flow into the American defense industry. That industry produces weapons that fuel conflicts in the same region. Money leaves Iran as oil, returns through Gulf arms purchases, enters the US budget, and exits again as congressional lobbying. Does this remind you of how the Ottoman Empire's war debts in the 17th century flowed to English bankers, who then financed the empire's rivals? Because the ultimate creditors of Ottoman war debt were also funding its enemies. Follow similar patterns today in the financing of the Ukraine war, or trace Russian energy revenues through European banking systems, and you will see the 21st century version of the same cycle. Now, for one final shock. At the beginning, I said the American Revolution was financed not for freedom, but for geopolitical interest. You may have thought, yes, but it still resulted in freedom, so the outcome was good. That's understandable. But consider this. Did France and Spain achieve the outcome they wanted? Did England truly weaken? Yes, but within a decade, the French Revolution erupted. The financial burden of supporting America destabilized the French treasury so severely that it contributed to Louis's execution in 1793. A proxy war consumes its financier too, because the power you create eventually comes to demand its own reckoning. Consider how actors once supported by the United States, like the Taliban against the Soviets or Saddam Hussein against Iran, later turned into challengers themselves. This is the deepest paradox of proxy war. The force you finance, once it defeats your enemy, becomes strong enough to become your enemy. If America was once a rebellion financed from abroad, and today is the financier itself, and if every financier is eventually challenged by the power it creates, then what stage of the cycle are we in today, in the Middle East? And in the next turn of this wheel, who will be crushed beneath it? History does not give you the answer, but it always leaves clues in advance. To see those clues, you must follow the money, unmask the propaganda, and most importantly, be willing to question everything you have learned. Because power is won not only on battlefields, but in the rooms where stories are written. And now you are beginning to see that room.
If you find this video interesting, please like and subscribe to discover more.